Have you ever noticed how much some Christians talk about what horrible sinners they are all the time? It sure sounds biblical, but is it actually? Well, let's find out. Hey everyone, I'm Colin, the resident nerd and Bible scholar here at the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. This is something I wish someone would have told me when I first became a Christian. Sinner is not an identity marker you should be taking for yourself. Now, to be sure, we all do things that are wrong sometimes, and we have to admit that in order to move forward. The first step in making something right is admitting that you did something wrong. But the whole concept of being identified by the fact that you do something wrong is not a label that we should be taking on as our main identity marker. Let's look for a second at one of the most popular verses in the New Testament. It's part of the Romans Road that I learned when I was a kid, a series of verses in Romans used to share the gospel with people from an evangelical point of view. Romans 5:8 is particularly what I want to look at today. But God commendeth his love toward us, in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Now, that's the old King James translation I grew up with that I read. I can't hear the verse any other way. And it's not a bad translation by any means, but the way that language has changed over a few hundred years now has kind of obscured what this verse means for us today. Because, who uses the word for something? Unless you talk about someone getting a commendation for a good job at work or something like that, that's about the only time I can think of that being used in modern vocabulary. And even then, that doesn't really make sense in the verse. Like, if I'm commending you for a job well done, how does that definition fit in with God commending his love toward us? Well, many more modern versions will say something along the lines of God showed or demonstrated his love toward us in this particular way, that while we were still sinners, Jesus died for us. And that's fair. But that word commendeth, it's the Greek word sunistesi. And while I don't want to commit an etymological fallacy and say that a word can only mean what the sum of its parts means, we have the word butterfly and it has nothing to do with butter or a fly, so we have to be careful not to do that. But I think that in this case, the base definitions of this word actually really help us understand the verse better, because soon is a Greek preposition that means with. And istesi is based in a verb that means to stand. So literally, just going off of the etymology of the word, it means to stand with. So a very wooden literal rendering of this verse would be that God stood with love toward us. And I think that is absolutely beautiful. God stands on the side of love with us. So many people see God as a judgmental old man in the sky. And when you're reading some of Paul's work, like Romans, it can be really easy to see why people think that way sometimes. But here, within Romans, Paul is saying that God does not stand on the side of judgment with you. He's not on the other side of the courtroom behind a desk trying to get a guilty verdict from you. No, actually, he stands on the side of love when it comes to you. And I find it so fascinating that the one statement here, that while we were yet sinners, while we were still sinning, the Messiah, the Christ, died for us, died on our behalf. We take that and we assume the label of sinner instead of the label of forgiven and loved and redeemed. That's the whole thrust of the verse, and yet we choose to stick with the old label, the thing that we no longer need to be labeled as because of what Jesus did. I remember growing up in the Baptist church, and we often heard preaching against Catholicism. Now, much of it was stereotyped and not necessarily accurate representations of the Catholic faith. But one of the things that I heard frequently was that we have crosses and Catholics have crucifixes. We don't put Jesus on a cross. The Catholics worship a still crucified Jesus. We worship a risen Jesus. Now, that's not a very accurate representation of Catholic doctrine, but that's another matter for another day. What I want to focus on here is how for people who said that, when it came to this verse, they did not opt for the resurrected version of this story. They went with the pre-cross Jesus. They acted as if he is still on the cross. He didn't raise again. We don't have new life. They took on this label of sinner and told us that is who you are. Now, again, like I said at the start, we all do wrong sometimes, and we need to make that right. We need to admit that we have the capability of doing wrong, and yes, sometimes we do things that are wrong. But the label of sinner is not how we are known now. Choose the label of love. Choose the label of forgiven. Choose the label of redeemed. See, if you continue to do what so many Christians in churches all across America do, and think of yourself as still separated from God, even after believing in him, then you're going to start believing what you're thinking about yourself. And once you start believing that you are still separated from God because of the mistakes you make in life, then you start living like you're separated from God, even though Jesus died so that you wouldn't have to live that way. Sin doesn't define you unless you let it. If you really want to be like God, stand on the side of love, like Romans 5:8 says that he did towards you. Focus on love and accept that as your label instead of sinner.